The Falcons continue to beef up their defensive line. Eddie Goldman is coming back from retirement. They're visiting with Calais Campbell this week, but will it all culminate in the Falcons drafting Georgia's Jalen Carter in this year's draft?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM, managing your own football franchise, this is the game definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. And guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, and check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today is a good day because we got some good news. The Falcons reinstated defensive tackle Eddie Goldman from the reserve retired list. As you may recall, back in July, the Falcons signed Goldman to a one-year deal. And then less than 2 weeks later, he retired, and the Falcons put him on the reserve retired list. Well, apparently, Eddie's ready to come back and play football, and thus he's going to be back on the Falcons roster. And so, as I understand it, his contract will toll, which means basically it's the equivalent as if the Falcons signed him to a one-year contract today, right? Now, we've been talking about this team's need to get a one-tech nose tackle, and that's exactly what Eddie Goldman can provide. So he fills that need. As you recall, back in July, I was a big fan of the Falcons bringing in Eddie Goldman. Unfortunately, those dreams, shriveled up and died 13 days later. But it was one of the few moves that I liked the Falcons made last offseason. The thing that Eddie Goldman brings to the table is he's a three-down nose tackle, right? The rare three-down nose tackle, the rare nose tackle that can provide some juice in the pass rush game, as he did in Chicago for several years, where, of course, Ryan Pace had him. But he won't necessarily have to carry a heavy burden in terms of pass rush due to the presence of Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata here in Atlanta. And now with Taquan Graham as well, the Falcons are four deep at that D tackle position and seemingly have a complete D tackle rotation with those four guys. But that rotation might even get stronger because the Falcons are expected to meet with Calais Campbell later this week, according to NFL Network. Campbell is an older veteran player, but a potential Hall of Fame caliber player that was dominant for several years in Arizona and Jacksonville. He'll turn 37 on September 1st later this year. And he's still got something left in the tank. He's played pretty well for the Baltimore Ravens the last couple of years. Not the dominant player where he was one of the premier D tackles in the NFL, like he was in Arizona and Jacksonville. But, he's coming off a season in Baltimore where he had 5.5 sacks, 35 pressures. That's still very productive, much more productive than most 36-year-old D linemen. And again, the beauty of the idea of Calais Campbell coming to Atlanta is that deep rotation, right? Is that with four other players that he can rotate with, you're going to see a much well-rested Eddie Goldman. That's kind of the attractive thing that the Falcons can offer. Hey, you're not going to have to play, 40, 50 snaps anymore. You might only have to play 20 or 30 snaps every single game with this, deep tackle rotation. And with the Falcons, playing these hybrid fronts, if they go to their 3-4 looks, you can line up Calais Campbell at one end spot, Taquan Graham at the other end spot, Eddie Goldman in the middle on rundowns in their base defense. And then on passing downs, you can, pull those guys and put Onyemata and Grady Jarrett in the situation. And the Falcons can mix and match those combinations to their heart's content. Campbell, especially in Jacksonville, spent a lot of time playing on the edge out there on pass rushing situations, with that 6'8" frame, 36-inch arms. He just bullies tackles. And you could see a situation where the Falcons kick him outside to edge to give them a big physical run defending defensive end, like we saw, Ryan Nielsen and the Saints have with guys like Cam Jordan and whatnot. And so, if the goal is to play with lighter boxes, which has been sort of the thing that we've talked about with what we assume Ryan Nielsen's going to bring from New Orleans here to Atlanta as the Falcons' new defensive coordinator, having Calais Campbell in your front means that you can play with lighter boxes, because my man is a giant human being that can just bully offensive linemen and has been doing that for 15 years in the NFL. So these moves get me excited, right? But I've been burned once before by Eddie Goldman, so I can't get as excited today as I was, say, on July 10th or July 6th or whenever he signed with the Falcons last summer. And of course, I've been dreaming about some alternate reality where Calais Campbell is an Atlanta Falcon for basically the better part of 8 to 10 years now. And so it may finally come true, but I'm not going to necessarily get my hopes up on today's episode. We'll just sort of have to wait and see if Calais Campbell signs, but certainly, we're you see the smile on my face. Clearly I'm excited about this. And, here on Locked On Falcons, we don't like to promote terrorism, right? We are anti-terrorists here on Locked On Falcons, but, I think a court of law could actually convict somebody of an act of terror if, say the day that Calais Campbell visits Flowery Branch, a certain someone was to call in a bomb threat, right? Forcing everybody in that building, including Calais Campbell, to shelter in place. And that would just give the Falcons a little bit more time to, hammer out a contract. Again, you don't call the bomb threat on the Falcons buildings, right? Because then they would have to evacuate the buildings and therefore you can't get a deal done. But you just do it on the surrounding buildings. Again, I haven't thought about, calling in bomb threats on the Atlanta Falcons building or the adjacent buildings just because of the heartache that they have caused me over the last 30 years. That's not something I fantasize about either. But, just saying that theoretically someone could do that, later this week when Calais Campbell, and I don't know if they would go to jail. But again, we here on Locked On Falcons do not support terrorists. We do not negotiate with terrorists. But, maybe we'll make an exception later this week. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on that subject. But we'll continue talking about D tackles that could find their way in Atlanta, which is going to lead us to revisiting the Jalen Carter conversation. And I'll give you a definitive answer on whether or not the Falcons will take him if he happens to fall to them at the 8th overall draft selection in this upcoming draft. But before we get there, guys, it is Sweet 16 time, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000, which means you get bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. You can bet on everything from money line, point scores, threes drained. You can do it for the NCAA tournament. You could do it for NBA action. You could do it for XFL action. If you want to put in some NFL draft prop bets, I'm looking at, plus 1,600, 16-1 odds over who's going to draft Anthony Richardson. I'm looking at the Raiders, 16-1 odds. I'll take that all day, right? 25-1 odds for Jahmyr Gibbs landing in Atlanta with the Falcons. I'll take that bet as well. So you find a way to make your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. Could be one of those bets or something else. And again, you'll get bonus bets back if you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk about Jalen Carter, which we've talked about a couple of times here on the podcast. And I lied to you guys. I don't know if the Falcons are going to take him if he falls to them at 8. I lied. I'm sorry. I apologize. This conversation is sort of being revisited in part due to listening to a recent episode of Locked On NFL Draft Podcast with Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson, of course, find it wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube and elsewhere. And they were talking about, Jalen Carter's potential draft stock falling. This comes from Josh Kendall writing in The Athletic, who covers the Falcons, saying that the Falcons are likely to pass on him if he falls to 8. And so, again, if Jalen Carter does happen to fall to 8, will the Falcons take him? Again, no clue. My official answer is we'll find out on April 27th, right? And the reason why that's my answer is because, I can wax poetic. I can spend hours talking about Jalen Carter, the football player. I know little to nothing about Jalen Carter, the person. All I know is based off of things I've read or heard or anything. You go and you read the AJC's big article where they conducted their own investigation of all the things that happened on January 15th, when Devon Willock, former Georgia player, the late Georgia player, Chandler LaCroix, died in a car accident while allegedly racing Carter through the streets of Georgia, Athens, Georgia. And, again, that article is the only insights into the person, which is based off of the actions that Jalen Carter allegedly took those nights. His legal issues seem to be wrapped up. He pled no contest. He'll get probation, no jail time. That AJC article indicated that, local authorities, contemplated charging him with, a felony charges for like vehicular manslaughter for his involvement in that night. But they opted against doing that. And what I will say about Jalen Carter, the person, I am empathetic in some ways because he's had a tumultuous last couple of months, including what happened on January 15th. And, I know if I was in his shoes, knowing that I made some very poor decisions and it resulted in or contributed, let's say, in the deaths of other people, people that I knew well, that would absolutely destroy my mental health. And I'm certain, we can speculate about how much that has affected his mental health. And maybe that's contributing to his poor physical health, or at least his alleged poor physical health during last week's pro day, where he was reportedly out of shape and, had gained weight and all those various things. So there's really nothing else I think I can add to the Jalen Carter conversation. Sitting here speculating about what the Falcons will or won't do in the draft is, sort of above my pay grade. It's something I don't really know a ton about on what Terry Fontenot would do if presented with Jalen Carter being on the board at that time, right? I could sit here and tell you, hey, they'll absolutely take him. But I'd be, talking out my butt. And I could sit here and tell you that they'll pass on him, and I'd be talking about my butt. And that's not suggesting that, Josh Kendall's talking out of his butt by, making his statement on that subject. But, I would sit here and say that, if Jalen Carter is passed upon by several other teams picking ahead of the Falcons, I think the Falcons would be just as likely to pass on him as any of those teams. So the idea that, the Falcons are sort of unique and different than, how other teams operate in this situation, I have no idea. So, and it's just as likely that, he could not get passed up by these teams. And, all the speculation about what would happen if Jalen Carter is on the board at 8, becomes moot at that point in time. So again, I have no idea what's going to happen, and we'll find out April 27th. Again, that's my official stance. So like basically what I do here on this podcast, guys, is, I try to do the best to do my research and connect dots and do these various things, especially when it comes to the draft, because again, I don't know what's going to happen, right? We'll find out on April 27th, right? So like, an example of the dot connecting that I can do is I can look at, okay, in 2021, the Falcons added a bunch of offensive linemen that offseason that had shorter arms. And then in 2022, they added a bunch of offensive linemen that had longer arms. And so therefore, if I connect those dots, okay, maybe I say the Falcons now value arm length when it comes to their offensive line evaluation. So in a world where the Falcons were to take a tackle at 8, maybe they would be a little bit higher on Ohio State offensive tackle Paris Johnson Jr., who has 36 plus inch arms that rank in the 96th percentile among offensive linemen, over, say, Northwestern's Peter Skoronski, whose 32 and a quarter inch arms are in the 4th percentile for offensive linemen. And, it's certainly possible, despite the dot connecting, that we might get the draft day and the Falcons, would draft Peter Skoronski because, for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're not looking for a tackle. Maybe they're looking for a guard. Maybe they project Skoronski better at guard. Maybe they don't care as much about arm length if a guy is playing on the inside. Another example of this dot connecting, both of the Falcons' first round picks over the last 2 years in Kyle Pitts and Drake London were 20 years old on the day that the Falcons drafted them. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. I have no idea. All I can do is connect dots and speculate. And, you look at, say, the possibility of the Falcons taking a corner at 8. Christian Gonzalez is going to be 20 years old, won't turn 21 until I believe May. Meanwhile, Devon Witherspoon out of Illinois and Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon, Devon Witherspoon's going to be 22 on draft day. Is that going to influence which corner they prefer? I don't know, but I can connect dots and say, okay, well, they tend to like younger players, at least in round 1. So who knows? So I will connect these dots. I will base things off of precedent. But ultimately, I do not know what's going to happen on draft night. So there's little else I can add to the Jalen Carter conversation. So we'll find out on April 27th if he falls, and we'll find out if the Falcons wind up taking him. And again, I can talk endlessly about the football player, but not so much about the person. That's definitely above my pay grade. Now, what I do get paid to do is to judge what the Falcons do. And we'll see what the Falcons do on April 27th. Now, I'm sure some of you may be looking at, concerns about Jalen Carter's maturity and character. And, if you wanted to, build a narrative that you prefer to build over the next, 5+ weeks, you could do so by saying, okay, well, if you're worried about those issues with Jalen Carter, what better locker room could he join than one that's already filled with Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, and possibly Calais Campbell that could certainly straighten him out really quick. So again, if you want to speculate that makes sense, the Falcons are going after Calais Campbell so that they can get Jalen Carter in the draft, that is more, that is your prerogative. Live your life however you want to live it. Don't let some random dude on a podcast tell you how to live your life. But again, other than just basically saying like, oh, that's a possibility, just like it's, any other outcome is a possibility. That's all I can do here on the podcast. So we will leave that aside and catch you guys up on the most recent Falcons free agent news. And we learned exactly what role the team envisions for newly signed cornerback Mike Hughes, and the Falcons could be looking to add to their offensive line in near future due to the loss of offensive tackle Chuma Edoga. And we'll break that down as we continue today's episode. But today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM, and you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game. And as you guys watch the Falcons make their moves all week long, I'm sure you feel like you can make some more moves yourself, and that's why you should check out the Ultimate Football GM. I know recently in an offseason I conducted, I went out there and went spending in free agency, got me a premier offensive tackle, got me a premier defensive tackle. Probably not on the level of Calais Campbell, but certainly an older veteran type of player that really could solidify my defensive line. And that's the beauty of Ultimate Football GM, because you handle every strategic aspect of your team, from free agency, hiring coaches, making trades, going through the draft, and going through all the ups and downs in the season. It's a challenging and realistic game world, and you can play it completely for free. It's playable offline, and Locked On listeners will get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On in all caps. That's LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. So to download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So let's catch up on the free agent news in the last 24 hours. And I'm sure, as has been usually the norm over this week, maybe there will be some other breaking news as this episode is airing on YouTube. And so therefore there will be even more news to catch you guys up on tomorrow's episode. But, Mike Hughes wound up signing 15 minutes after I finished recording yesterday's episode, officially signing. We did discuss, his visit, not the official signing on yesterday's episode. We discussed sort of the value of Mike Hughes having that inside outside versatility, being not only a guy that has experience playing outside corner, but also lots of experience playing in the slot as a nickel corner. And it seems like the Falcons value the latter, that nickel inside ability, based off of the comments that Mike Hughes made to the media when he signed on Monday night, saying that they see him as more of a slot nickel guy. And that probably means that the Falcons intend for him and Dee Alford to compete for the vacant nickel cornerback spot to fill the shoes of Isaiah Oliver, who wound up signing this past week with the 49ers. So yes, they do clearly see him as an Isaiah Oliver, potential Isaiah Oliver replacement. And the thing that we discussed on yesterday's episode that we'll reiterate for those of you that missed it is that when you look at least at the PFF grades, I haven't sat down and watched the film yet. I'll probably do that over the course of the next couple of days. But when Mike Hughes has been on the outside, he is graded out much better than he has when he's played in the nickel. And you look at some of the other metrics, especially I went through and compared some of other PFF's metrics with Mike Hughes and Isaiah Oliver and Dee Alford. And I think most of those metrics indicated that Hughes is a downgrade from Oliver, at least based off of his, slot versus slot snaps. Now, the PFF metrics would suggest that maybe Hughes is a better outside corner than Oliver was an outside corner earlier in his career. So that will be something that would be interesting. But one area where I do think, at least the PFF numbers suggest that, Hughes may be an upgrade over Oliver is maybe in run support. That was something that Oliver, was pretty good at. He missed a number of tackles over the last couple of years, but generally you felt good about his contributions in run support. Hughes is also a seemingly much more reliable tackler. Although it's notable that, the numbers suggest that he tends to miss more tackles when he's in the slot than he does when he's playing on the outside. But, it'll be interesting to see the battle between him and Dee Alford, because I think based off of Dee Alford's very limited body of work, where he was a part-time slot corner for the Falcons for most of the season, only really got extended action as their primary slot corner in one game. That was the Week 5 game against the Bucs, and it was kind of a up and down performance. There was some very good Dee Alford, and there was some questionable Dee Alford in that game. But one area I think is a concern for the Falcons with Dee Alford potentially taking over as a full-time nickel cornerback is being 175 pounds. That may be an issue for the Falcons when it comes to playing their nickel. Although while I think Alford, did an admirable job and plays bigger than his size would indicate when it comes to the run, that may be something that the Falcons are concerned with, which would attract them to a player like Hughes, who's probably a little bit more of a reliable tackler. And that's important because in the nickel, it's important for those guys to have run support responsibilities, because oftentimes in the NFL, nickel means you're having playing with 5 defensive backs. And that usually means that 5th defensive back, that slot corner, usually is replacing a linebacker from team's base defense. Right. And so you're going to lose a little bit if you go from a 230-pound linebacker, in this case, to Dee Alford, 175-pound cornerback. Not as big a drop off if you're going to a 205-pound Isaiah Oliver and then, 195-pound Mike Hughes. But, that notion of taking advantage of teams, running against teams that are in their nickel, that was kind of, the core strength of the Sean McVay offense early in his time in Los Angeles, where they would play these 11 personnel, those 3 wide receiver sets on over 90% of the snaps. And the way that NFL defenses often deploy base versus nickel is in that versus 11 personnel versus multiple receivers, they'll almost always deploy nickel stuff. And Sean McVay took advantage of that by just pounding it down their throat with Todd Gurley in those years. And then you have Kyle Shanahan, who's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, who plays a lot of 21 personnel with a fullback, Kyle Juszczyk, and a tight end on the field in George Kittle, and he's going to force you to play base defense with those personnel groupings, and then he's going to throw it on you. And of course, the Atlanta Falcons style is basically let's go with run-heavy personnel and just continue to run the football, and especially now with Mac Hollins on the team, that will continue to be their strength. But, I think there'll be an ongoing conversation about that battle between Hughes and Alford. I'm expecting at this point in time Alford to win that battle, just because, again, I think Alford gives you has shown you a lot more promise based off of his limited history in the NFL as a nickel corner, as opposed to Hughes, who has just always been inconsistent or unreliable based off of the PFF numbers. Again, I'll confirm that via film later this week. But we'll see how Hughes's contract is structured. It's reportedly a 2-year deal. Haven't heard any terms on the exact money of it. But my thought process on trying to figure out why the Falcons signed him to a 2-year deal rather than the ubiquitous 1-year contract is, I think, to have him as a potential option to replace Casey Hayward in 2024. right, at that outside cornerback spot, assuming Casey Hayward is no longer with the Falcons, which I think is probably a safe assumption. 2023 this year is Casey Hayward's final year of his contract, and he's going to turn 34 in September. And so you could imagine, even if he does wind up playing really well, which Casey Hayward is seemingly ageless wonder, similar to Calais Campbell, um, you know, you would imagine the Falcons will be looking to try to get younger at that position, regardless of how the season goes. And Hughes gives them at least one option, right, to be that starter in the event that they don't necessarily use one of their premium picks in this year's draft on that future starter at the cornerback position. That's certainly a possibility in round one. And has been, for me, I've said it many times on this podcast, earlier this offseason, that I thought that was a likely, not on that bandwagon at this point in time. My best guess right now, sitting here today, is I think they'll probably be more inclined to go edge in round one and probably wait till day two to get another corner that can come in and be stashed behind Casey Hayward and whatnot. But another possibility for what they could do on the second day of the draft would be taking an offensive tackle, and that's where we'll leave the cornerback conversation to move to the Chuma Edoga conversation. I've consistently been mocking tackles to the Falcons, in rounds 3, rounds 4, round 5 throughout this offseason, due to my belief that they need to upgrade their swing tackle position, and that need only got more pressing because on Tuesday, Chuma Edoga signed a 1-year contract with the Dallas Cowboys. I was hoping that the Falcons would find a way to retain Chuma Edoga, who did play really well for the Falcons in one spot start as an injury replacement at left guard. We didn't get to see him at tackle, but obviously from his time in New York playing both left and right tackle, it made sense for him to be their sort of in-house option to be that swing tackle in the event that the draft doesn't necessarily break the way that they would like it to. Again, that's always the thing about the draft, is like, you don't control, who's going to be on the board and when players are going to go. So you want to have as many questions answered going into the draft, at least in my opinion, as possible, so that you don't necessarily have to feel the need to be desperate and reach on players in the draft because of that. And I think that's what Chuma Edoga offered, a guy that not only, potentially, assuming if he could play guard and tackle, has, 4 position versatility. So obviously the Cowboys are attracted to him just because of all the injuries they've dealt with, especially at the tackle position with Tyron Smith the last couple of years. So obviously it's a good signing for the Cowboys. Unfortunately, the Falcons, the Cowboys, the Cowboys treasure, whatever. You you know what I'm trying to say. Like, he benefits the Cowboys and it hurts the Falcons. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So we'll see what the Falcons do. We'll see if they get their swing tackle in the draft, or do they bring in a veteran in the meantime, right? I don't expect that to be Jermaine Ifedi, although, I think this increases the odds. I thought, going into the offseason, there was like a 4% chance that they would re-sign Jermaine Ifedi, largely due to, I didn't think he was that effective last year. He only played 8 snaps in 2022 for the Falcons, mostly as a blocking tight end, but he consistently struggled to execute his assignments even in that limited role. And so it was just like, do you really want that guy? He's struggling to block guys on the edge as a tight end. Like, do you really feel great about him being your tackle? But now I guess those odds go from 4% to, let's say, 24%, maybe higher, that the Falcons do bring him back just to have another option that's at least familiar to them. We'll see if they, pursue other, veteran free agents out there. There are certainly options that they could go out there and find another swing tackle that can come in, for relatively cheap, and sort of keep that spot warm until the draft. So we'll see if the Falcons do that. We'll see what other moves the Falcons make later this week. Tomorrow we'll probably get into the DeAndre Hopkins rumors. I feel like it's worthwhile to spend some time talking about that. We'll probably, hopefully, get into Jesse Bates a little bit further, just because we do have, I did talk to Jake Lisco, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Bengals, about Jesse Bates, and I was initially planning on, airing that conversation today. But then the Eddie Goldman and Calais Campbell news broke, and it was like, okay, well, that trumps that. So we'll just keep punting that down the road until we get to the day where the Falcons are pretty chill and we can just do that. But hopefully that's tomorrow. If not, then it'll be later in the week. Eventually Jake, that episode will air like April 8th. And Jake will be like, we talked about that like 4 months ago. Anyway, so that's what's in store for here on Locked On Falcons. Please continue to make us your first listen each and every day. And for your second listen, guys, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes podcast. From free agency to the draft, salary cap management. Join NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Go check out a recent episode of Locked On NFL Draft Scouting, or Locked On NFL Scouting. I always want to call it Locked On NFL Draft Scouting. Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. They broke down, the possibilities of a Jonah Williams trade. And it was an interesting conversation. Doesn't have anything to do with the Falcons, but, if you want to be smarter about football, Kyle and Joe will definitely help you do that and talk about, the pros and cons of, the Bengals trading Jonah Williams. Does another team want to bring in Jonah Williams? What is his role? It's a great episode. Go check it out by subscribing to Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcast. Really appreciate it, guys. Till then.